The last tendrils of the road dissolved into a track of broken gravel, each stone spitting beneath the tires of my rented estate car. Beyond the windscreen, the Scottish Highlands swallowed the late afternoon light, a vast, bruised landscape of heather and rock. Mist, thin as a shroud, clung to the distant peaks, blurring the line between earth and sky. It felt like driving into a forgotten pocket of the world, a place time had overlooked. And then, through a sudden break in the gnarled pines, it appeared. Blackwood Manor. It wasn't a grand revelation, more a gaunt silhouette against the fading gray. The estate was less a house and more a monolithic scar on the land, its dark stone walls bleeding into the surrounding gloom. Turrets like broken teeth clawed at the low cloud cover. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the crumbling masonry, a slow, relentless strangulation. My chest tightened, a knot of something I couldn't quite name, anticipation mixed with a prickle of dread. This was it, the ancestral home I'd only ever seen in faded photographs, the key to a lineage I barely understood. My grey-tansel had been clear if cryptic. Jasper, the manor awaits its rightful keeper. The archives must be tended. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant bleating of a sheep and the whistle of the wind through the pines. The air, even through the closed windows, carried the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic like old iron and rain. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was an obligation. My meticulous historian's brain, usually so eager for new data, felt a strange reluctance. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the heavy oak door. It was scarred and weathered, adorned with a tarnished bronze knocker shaped like a raven's head. No doorbell, of course. I hesitated, then pushed. To my surprise, it groaned inward with a protesting sigh, revealing a cavernous, dust-choked hall. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something sweet, like forgotten potpourri mixed with old paper. Cobwebs, thick and gray, draped from every high ceiling, catching the slivers of light that fought their way through grimy stained glass windows. My footsteps echoed unnaturally on the flagstone floor as I moved deeper, my small backpack feeling ridiculously inadequate. This place wasn't merely old, it felt ancient, burdened by its own history. My purpose here was clear: to catalog the forgotten archives, to make sense of the generations of Blackwoods who had lived and died within these walls. I was a man of order, of facts, of documented history. This chaos, this slow decay, was a challenge to be conquered. Yet, as I navigated the winding corridors, my determination felt increasingly fragile. I found myself in what must have been the main drawing room. A grand fireplace dominated one wall, its mantelpiece adorned with peculiar carvings, swirling, interlocking patterns that weren't quite Celtic knots, not quite anything I recognized. They looked organic, like roots or veins, but also impossibly precise. It gave me an odd, shivery feeling, as if the pattern was meant to contain something, or perhaps to invoke it. Ignoring the growing unease, I decided to seek out something practical. The house needed power, water. My Grey-Tance solicitor had mentioned a generator, somewhere in the service quarters. I fumbled for my phone's torch, its beam cutting through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and doors that had seen better centuries. One door at the very end of the corridor stood slightly ajar. From within, I could hear a low, rhythmic thrumming. "Ah, the generator," I murmured, a small wave of relief washing over me. But as I pushed the door open, my relief evaporated, replaced by a fresh surge of confusion. It wasn't a generator room. I stood in the laundry room with humming machines. Two monstrous, industrial-sized washing machines and a dryer, all of an antique design, dominated the space. And one of the washing machines, its heavy brass door firmly shut, was running. A slow, churning hum emanated from its depths, a steady, mechanical breathing. My brow furrowed. I hadn't turned on the power. There was no electricity to the house. I was sure of it. The lights hadn't come on upstairs and my phone charger wasn't working. This was impossible. The machine's metal casing felt cool to the touch, not warm from operation. Yet the hum was undeniable, a deep vibration that resonated in my teeth. I pressed my ear against the brass door, hearing the slosh of water and the heavy rotation of a drum. What could possibly be inside? And more importantly, who could have started it? I was alone. I had to be alone. My heart, which I'd consciously kept steady all day, began to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against my ribs. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the latch. It was stiff, protesting, but eventually gave way. The heavy door swung open with a hiss of trapped air. Steam, faintly scented with something like ozone and old linen, billowed out. I peered inside, my torch beam cutting through the vapor. There, tumbling slowly with the last of the sudsy water, was a single garment. It wasn't a towel or a sheet, nothing practical. It was a child's nightgown made of a fine, almost translucent lace, yellowed with age. Its intricate embroidery depicted the same swirling, root-like patterns I'd seen carved into the drawing room mantel, a color that looked disturbingly like dried blood. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant bleating of a sheep and the whistle of the wind through the pines. Well, I couldn't quite place it, but it wasn't pleasant. It hung heavy, a taste on the back of my tongue. Stepping out, the gravel crunched under my boots, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the oppressive quiet. Blackwood Manor loomed, a gaunt silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its windows, dark and vacant, felt less like glass and more like empty eye sockets. The front door, a heavy slab of oak, groaned open with a reluctant shriek when I finally managed to turn the stiff iron handle. My first few hours were a blur of practicalities. I hauled my bags inside, found the main fuse box surprisingly functional, and managed to coax a few lamps into sputtering life, casting weak, jaundiced pools against the encroaching gloom. The next morning, fortified by instant coffee and a stale biscuit, I began my true work, locating the archives. My initial survey had revealed a promising wing on the ground floor, tucked away behind the main dining hall. The door, when I found it, was heavy, unpainted wood and surprisingly unlocked. Shelves, floor to ceiling, bowed under the weight of countless tomes, unbound papers, and leather-bound journals. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating a scene of magnificent scholarly chaos. This was it, my purpose. I started methodically, as any historian would, from left to right, top to bottom. The initial findings were exactly what I'd expected. Ledgers detailing estate expenses from the 18th century, genealogical records, correspondence between long-dead ancestors and their land agents. Dry, but fascinating in its own way. I set up a small folding table I'd brought, spreading out my tools, acid-free gloves, a magnifying glass, a digital camera, and a notebook for initial observations. Hours bled into one another. It began subtly. A soft thud from the floor above, which I dismissed as the old house settling. The faint, rhythmic creak of timbers, a symphony of age. But then, as the afternoon light began to fade, things became less easily explained. I was cataloging a box of late 19th century land deeds when I heard a distinct, low scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across stone, coming from the far end of the archive room, near a section of shelves dedicated to what looked like personal effects. I paused, tilting my head. Nothing, just the rustle of the papers in my hand. I went back to work. A minute later, a book, a thick, leather-bound volume from a shelf about 10 feet away, tilted slowly on its spine and then, with a soft thump, fell flat onto the shelf below. It wasn't a landslide, it was a single, deliberate movement. My breath hitched. I told myself it was the vibration of the house settling. Old books. My eyes would ache from trying to snatch them, to pin them down, but they were always gone. My rational mind, the well-trained historian, argued with my gut, which was starting to hum with unease. It was in a small, unmarked box, tucked behind a collection of ancient maps, that I made my first truly unsettling discovery. Not a ledger, not a deed, but a series of small, hand-stitched journals. Their covers were rough, made from what felt like cured animal hide, and bound with coarse twine. No titles, no dates, just peculiar, intricate carvings pressed into the leather swirling patterns that reminded me of knots, or perhaps stylized roots, but with an unsettling, almost predatory sharpness to their curves. Inside, the script was an archaic, spidery hand, difficult to decipher at first. But what truly stopped me were the sketches. Crude, yes, but undeniably disturbing. Figures, elongated and distorted, sometimes missing faces, sometimes with mouths stretched impossibly wide. They were always surrounded by those same swirling, knot-like patterns, sometimes seeming to be consumed by them. And then the words, painstakingly translated, fragmented accounts of local disappearances. The shepherd's daughter lost to the mist, the traveler taken by the woods, the child simply gone. These weren't just vague folk tales, they were specific dates, specific names echoing through centuries. The metallic tang I'd noticed outside seemed stronger in here now, mixed with the must of old paper, almost like the scent of rust and something else, something I couldn't name, but which made the hairs on my arms prickle. As dusk deepened, the sounds intensified. Not just creaks, but distinct shuffling from the floor above, like something heavy being dragged. I was being watched. I knew it. The feeling was a palpable pressure on the back of my neck, a sense of eyes drilling into me from the gloom between the towering shelves. My bladder, however, had its own demands. I found the laundry room with humming machines in the basement, a surprisingly modern addition to the ancient manor. The washing machine and dryer, clearly recently used, were still running, their low, rhythmic thrumming filling the small, brightly lit space. It was a jarring contrast to the rest of the house, almost comforting. I relieved myself quickly, washed my hands, and for a moment just stood there, breathing in the clean scent of detergent. Then the humming machine sputtered. The dryer groaned, its rhythmic tumble slowing to a jerky halt. The sudden cessation of sound was far more jarring than any noise. I stared at the two appliances, uncomprehending. They'd been running perfectly. I reached for the dryer door, intending to check it when I saw it. On the pristine white surface of the dryer, where moments ago there had been nothing, was a faint, almost translucent smear. It wasn't dirt. I snatched my hand back, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't alone, not anymore. Something I couldn't name, but which made the hairs on my arms prickle. It was an unsettling, almost hungry smell. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that old houses just had their own unique bouquet of decay and neglect. My historian's mind demanded logic, demanded data. I spent the next few hours immersed in the dusty, silent archives, the only sounds the rustle of paper and the occasional creak of the old house settling around me. The meticulous work of categorizing and cross-referencing usually calmed me, but today, a persistent hum of unease vibrated just beneath the surface of my concentration. The metallic tang lingered, a ghostly scent that seemed to follow me even as I moved between the towering shelves. A dull ache began to throb behind my eyes, a combination of the dim light and the sheer volume of forgotten lives I was sifting through. I decided to take a short break, to clear my head and stretch my legs. The rhythmic thrumming of the antique washing apparatus, a relic that probably hadn't been used in decades, was surprisingly loud in the otherwise silent manor. It was a strange, anachronistic presence, these dormant machines giving off a low, mechanical growl. I ran a hand over the cold metal of a large industrial dryer, its surface slick with a thin layer of grime. As I leaned against a stack of forgotten, mildewed linens, trying to focus on the mundane hum, my gaze drifted to a section of the wall that seemed off. It wasn't the peeling wallpaper or the water stains that caught my eye, but a subtle discoloration in the wood paneling directly behind the largest washing machine. It was a darker hue, almost like a shadow that refused to lift, even in the faint light filtering through a grimy window high above. Curiosity, my oldest companion, nudged me. I pushed the heavy machine a few inches to the side, grunting with effort. The wood behind it was indeed different. Not just discolored, but a faint seam, almost imperceptible, ran vertically down the center. My fingers, still gloved, traced the line. It wasn't a natural join. It was a door cleverly concealed. A rush of adrenaline, sharp and unexpected, cut through my fatigue. With careful persistence, I found a tiny, almost invisible latch, disguised as part of the paneling's natural grain. It clicked open with a soft sigh of displaced air. Behind it lay a shallow recess, barely large enough to hold a single, leather-bound book. The book wasn't large, perhaps the size of my hand, but it radiated an aura of immense age and disuse. Its cover was a dark, almost black leather, warped and brittle, with no title or distinguishing marks. I pulled it out, the leather crumbling slightly under my touch. The pages inside were thick handmade paper, brittle and yellowed, covered in a spidery, archaic script. It wasn't Gaelic, nor any Latin I immediately recognized. This was older, stranger. Back at my makeshift workstation, under the focused beam of my archival lamp, I began to decipher the strange text. It took time, a frustrating, meticulous process of comparing letter forms to various ancient scripts I knew. Eventually, I pieced together enough to realize it was a dialect of Old Scots, heavily influenced by some local pre-Christian tongue. The content, however, was what truly seized me. It wasn't a ledger or a diary or a family tree. It was a chronicle, a warning. It described an entity that lurked in the liminal spaces of the Highlands, particularly drawn to places where memories were strong, where identities were deeply rooted. It didn't kill, not in the traditional sense. Instead, it unwove. It steals the threads of self. I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper in the echoing room. Takes the beloved face, the cherished name, the remembered joy, a return of a specific lineage to its ancestral home. It spoke of the manor itself as a kind of anchor, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a feeding ground. It described how those affected would slowly forget who they were, their memories fading like old photographs, their personalities eroding until they were mere husks, their physical forms remaining but their essence devoured. Then they would disappear entirely, leaving no trace. This was folklore, a local legend, a terrifying fairy tale designed to keep children from wandering too far into the mists. Yet the precise language, the recurring themes of memory and identity, the mention of disappearances, it all began to connect with the fragmented entries I'd already found in the manor's ledgers. The sudden, unexplained absences of estate workers, the terse notes about lost souls or gone to the mists, and the strange occurrences I'd experienced myself. Could these be echoes, residual disturbances from the weaver's activity? The thought made my stomach clench. These weren't just old house quirks, were they? This wasn't just my imagination running wild in a spooky old manor. This wasn't just history I was cataloging. It was a living, breathing threat, and it felt as though the threads of my own memory, my own identity, were suddenly exposed, vulnerable. The metallic tang in the air now seemed to taste of rust and fear, my fear, and the unidentifiable scent, the one I couldn't name. It smelled like something ancient and patiently waiting. I reread the last few lines of the journal, my stomach still clenched tight. Echoes, residual disturbances. The concept chilled me more than any explicit threat. It implied the weaver wasn't just some dormant evil, but an active, insidious presence, leaving behind a psychic residue that could warp reality itself. My own experiences the fleeting sense of brine and peat smoke where none should be, the whispers that dissolved before I could parse them, the unnerving sensation of being observed, the subtle, impossible shifts in the manor's internal geography. They weren't just my imagination. They were traces. I slammed the journal shut. This was absurd. I was a historian, a man of facts and verifiable data, not ghost stories. I needed a break from the archives, a mundane task to anchor me back to reality, perhaps some laundry. I pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing the laundry room with humming machines. 2 ancient industrial washers and a dryer, surprisingly functional given their age, stood against the far wall, their dull gray metal gleaming faintly under the single bare bulb that swung from the ceiling. I started a load, the water sloshing and churning, the detergents releasing a clean, sterile scent that momentarily cut through the pervasive damp. I leaned against a cold stone pillar, watching the clothes tumble. It was then that a memory flickered, sharp and clear. My graduation day. My parents beaming, my father's hand resting proudly on my shoulder. I could almost feel the rough wool of his suit jacket. But then a subtle distortion, my mother's face. Her smile was too wide, her eyes a shade too bright, almost predatory. The hand on my shoulder felt heavy, a burden, not an embrace. I blinked, shaking my head. What was that? A trick of the light, a momentary lapse in concentration. But the image persisted, unsettling. They were hazy, like trying to remember a dream that was slipping away. I could reconstruct the facts. My parents were there. They were proud, but the emotional texture, the specific details, felt like they'd been smudged, altered. Later, back in my study, the feeling intensified. I picked up a framed photograph of myself from my university days, standing beside a colleague, a fellow researcher with whom I'd shared many late nights poring over ancient texts. His name. What was his name? It was right there on the tip of my tongue, a familiar echo in my mind, but it wouldn't coalesce. I could see his face, his distinctive shock of red hair, the way he always chewed on the end of his pen, but his name, a blank. Panic began to prickle at the edges of my composure. This wasn't just a lapse. This was deliberate. The Weaver. It was targeting me. My memories, the very anchors of my identity, were being unraveled, thread by thread, to catalog the archives, to understand my family's lineage. But even that felt flimsy. Had I truly been so meticulous, so driven by academic curiosity? Or was there another, deeper compulsion, a sense of belonging I'd never consciously acknowledged? The thought was alien, yet it felt strangely resonant, as if a new layer of truth was being laid over my established past. The manor around me seemed to respond to my escalating distress. The air grew heavier, thick with an unspoken presence. I heard a faint scratching from the walls, like something scuttling just beneath the plaster, and the distant, rhythmic thrumming of the laundry machine seemed to morph into a low, guttural growl that resonated through the floorboards. I was certain I caught the faint, cloying scent of something like decaying flowers, a sickly sweetness that made my stomach churn. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my mobile phone. No signal. Of course. The Highlands were notorious for patchy reception. I cursed under my breath and then remembered the old landline in the drawing room. It was antique, yes, but I'd seen the wiring. It should work. Nothing. I pressed the buttons, listened again, still nothing. The line was completely dead. I was cut off, physically isolated, my car, my only other way out. I snatched my keys from the hook by the door and practically ran to the main entrance. The heavy oak door groaned open, revealing a sky bruised purple and gray, the wind whipping through the ancient trees. I inserted the key into the ignition, my hands trembling slightly. I turned it. The engine sputtered, a weak, pathetic cough, and then died. I tried again. I tried a third time, holding the key for longer, willing it to roar to life. The clicking grew fainter, then ceased altogether. The car was dead. Completely, utterly dead. I leaned back against the headrest, my eyes staring blankly through the windshield at the desolate landscape. The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to echo my own burgeoning despair. My phone was useless, the landline was dead, and my car wouldn't start. I was trapped. The memories I was losing, the ones being twisted into something unrecognizable, felt like vital organs being slowly, painlessly removed. I didn't know who I was anymore or why I was here. All I knew was the overwhelming, suffocating certainty that something ancient and malevolent had finally turned its full attention on me, and it intended to consume every last fragment of Jasper. Echoes, residual disturbances. The concept chilled me more than any explicit threat. Everything. The air in the study felt suddenly heavy, pressing in on me, not with cold, but with a strange, almost humid density. I needed a change of scenery, a new angle, perhaps something less intellectual, something tangible. My thoughts drifted to the manor's unseen corners, the places I hadn't yet properly catalogued. The journal had mentioned the necessity of cleansing the remnants, a cryptic phrase that now echoed with sinister undertones. It sent me to the lower levels, a forgotten wing that housed the old utility rooms. The air here was thick, muggy with the scent of stale water, lye, and a faint, metallic tang I couldn't place. Two immense, cast-iron washing machines, relics from a bygone era, vibrated with a low, insistent thrum that resonated through the flagstone floor. A heavy iron mangle stood like a silent sentinel in the corner, its rollers caked with ancient lint. I ran my hand along the rough stone wall behind the larger of the washing machines, the vibration a constant tremor against my palm. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light filtering through a grimy, high-set window. My fingers snagged on something not a loose stone but a distinct seam. It was almost perfectly flush, hidden by centuries of grime and paint, but undeniably there. Behind it lay a shallow recess, barely wide enough for my hand. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and a fine layer of grit, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and etched with a symbol I didn't recognize, a knot of interwoven lines, strangely reminiscent of a spider's web, but with an unsettling, organic flow. Next to it, brittle with age, was a folded piece of parchment. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the document. It wasn't a deed or a will or any legal document I was familiar with. It was a covenant, a testament titled simply, The Keeper's Vow. My eyes scanned the elegant yet unsettling script. Let it be known to the bloodline of Blackwood that the manor stands as a threshold and the descendant as its key. When the age of forgetting draws near and the veil thins, the keeper of echoes shall return. Their mind, a fertile ground of amassed histories and cherished memories, shall be the vessel, their spirit the conduit. For the weaver hungers not for flesh but for the intricate tapestry of identity itself, for the essence of what makes one remembered. The words blurred, then sharpened, each one a hammer blow to my understanding. The humming of the machines suddenly wasn't just a sound. It was a rhythmic pulse, a deep, resonant throb that seemed to vibrate in my very bones, echoing the words I'd just read. It wasn't an inheritance, not truly. It was a summons. I hadn't just stumbled upon Blackwood Manor. I had been drawn here, pulled by an ancient, insidious current. My meticulous nature, my obsession with history and forgotten details, these weren't just personal traits. They were precisely what the weaver needed, a mind rich with the very sustenance it craved. I was not just an investigator. I was the bait, the lure, the unwitting catalyst. The parchment detailed the weaver's hunger not for the simple physical but for the profound. It didn't consume bodies, it consumed what defined them. Memories, experiences, the subtle nuances of personality, the very threads of a person's being. And my unique ancestral connection, the bloodline of Blackwood, made me the perfect, potent conduit for its full manifestation. My return had reignited its dormant hunger, not because I was a threat, but because I was the promised feast. My hands, still gripping the locket and the parchment, started to shake uncontrollably. The air in the laundry room grew heavy, almost viscous. The metallic tang intensified, tasting like old blood and ozone. My reflection in the grimy window showed a face I barely recognized, pale, wide-eyed, a mask of dawning horror. I wasn't here to solve a mystery. I was the central piece of it. I was the key, the vessel, the sacrifice. The weaver wasn't just out there. It was reaching in, its tendrils already tracing the pathways of my mind, eager to unravel the intricate tapestry of Jasper. My breath hitched. The humming of the machines suddenly wasn't just a sound. It was a rhythmic pulse, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate not just the floor beneath my feet, but the very bones inside my skull. I scrambled back from the tattered parchment, my heart hammering against my ribs, a wild, frantic drumbeat that threatened to drown out the low mechanical drone. My mind, the very thing it coveted, raced. I was the key. My memories, my identity, the sum of my life's experiences, and the vast repository of historical facts I diligently collected, all of it was food. It wanted to twist me, to weave my essence into its own horrifying tapestry. But I was a historian, not a victim. I wasn't some helpless ancestor to be erased. I gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, knuckles white. The old texts I'd pored over, the forgotten folklore, the obscure rituals of warding and banishment I'd dismissed as superstition, they weren't just stories anymore. They were my arsenal. My gaze swept around the laundry room with humming machines. The machines themselves, hulking gray beasts, whirred and clanked, their ceaseless motion a mocking counterpoint to my rising panic. Back in the library, I pulled down every book with so much as a mention of binding, of severing, of protection against unseen forces. My fingers, usually so careful, tore at brittle pages, tracing symbols and half-forgotten phrases. The old man, the estate's former caretaker, had always spoken of certain unpleasant currents that ran through the manor. He'd shown me specific carvings above doorways, patterns in the floorboards. I dismissed them as quaint local superstitions. Now, I saw them for what they were: desperate, ancient attempts to cage something that refused to be contained. One particular passage caught my eye, a fragmented text detailing a severance knot, a ritual meant to disrupt a parasitic connection by invoking a specific resonance of self against the other. It involved a particular arrangement of symbols drawn with chalk, a focal point made of iron, a chanted affirmation of identity. It was crude, archaic, but it was all I had. I gathered what I needed: a piece of old, brittle chalk from a dusty box in the study, a small, rusted iron key I'd found in a forgotten drawer, a handful of dried rowan berries from a bowl on the mantelpiece, an old protective charm, according to the texts. My hands trembled as I returned to the laundry room with humming machines. This was where it had made its presence most keenly felt, where the truth had been revealed. This was where I would fight back. The air grew heavy, like a blanket woven from shadows. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady my racing pulse. The chalk felt fragile in my grip. My historical knowledge, my family lineage, my core memories. I focused on each line, each angle, pouring my intent into the simple white dust. As the final line connected, a shiver ran through the floor. The humming of the machines shifted, becoming lower, deeper, almost a growl. I placed the rusted iron key in the center of the chalk pattern, then arranged the dried rowan berries around it. My heart pounded, a frantic tattoo against my ribs. Then I began the chant. The words were old Gaelic, guttural and unfamiliar on my tongue, but I forced them out, my voice raspy. Ismasi, nai tusa, nai bainfi tu diam. I am myself, you are not, you will not take from me. I repeated it over and over, trying to inject every ounce of my will into the ancient syllables. The response was immediate and terrifying. The lights in the laundry room with humming machines flickered violently, not just dimming, but stuttering, as if struggling to hold onto existence. The humming of the machines escalated into a deafening roar, a cacophony of grinding metal and shrieking steam. A blast of frigid air slammed into me, smelling of decay and something utterly alien, something that felt like the absence of all warmth and light. Then came the whispers. They weren't words, not exactly, but fragments of sensation, flashes of memory that weren't mine, yet felt intimately familiar. A child's fear, a scholar's despair, a lover's forgotten face. They swirled and crashed against the walls of my consciousness, a maelstrom of stolen identities. My chant faltered. The chalk symbols on the floor began to blur, not smudging, but dissolving as if eaten away by an invisible acid. The rowan berries shriveled, turning to black dust before my eyes. You are not yourself. You are mine. My own memories began to fracture like shards of glass. I saw myself, a younger Jasper in the British Museum, poring over ancient texts, the thrill of discovery electric in my veins. But then the image twisted. I screamed, a raw animal sound clutching my head. The severance knot wasn't just failing, it was being reversed. My attempt to define myself, to sever the connection, was being used against me, a conduit for the entity to siphon off what I held most dear. The roar of the machines became unbearable, a physical pressure on my eardrums. When the assault finally receded, leaving me gasping for breath, slumped against the cold stone floor, the laundry room with humming machines was eerily silent. The humming had stopped. The lights were dim but steady. The air was still, heavy with the stench of something burnt and bitter. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, my head aching. The chalk symbols were gone, leaving no trace. The rowan berries were dust. A specific memory, one I cherished. The day I first understood the true scope of the Roman Empire's influence on Scottish history, the exact moment I connected two disparate historical accounts, bridging a gap of centuries. It was a foundational memory for me, defining my passion, my path. I closed my eyes, reaching for it. The thrill, the specific passage I'd read, the dusty smell of the archive, the feeling of triumph. Nothing, a blank space. It wasn't just forgotten, it was gone, wiped clean. My analytical mind, my meticulous recall, my very identity as Jasper the historian felt thinned, like a page ripped from my own book. The entity hadn't just resisted, it had taken a piece of me for its trouble, and it had done so with terrifying ease. My desperate measure had not only failed, it had cost me dearly. The rhythmic pulse that had seized my attention now vibrated through the very floorboards beneath my feet in the laundry room with humming machines. It wasn't just the spin cycle of some ancient contraption. It was a thrumming that resonated in my teeth, a low, guttural growl that felt less like machinery and more like a monstrous throat. The words from the ancient text still echoed in my skull, each syllable a fresh bruise. The descendant as its key. The fluorescent lights overhead, flickering erratically, cast long, shuddering shadows that danced like specters on the peeling paint. It wasn't just here to twist the manor. It was here to twist me. To consume my accumulated knowledge, my very sense of self, to feed its insatiable hunger. A low thud from the far end of the room made me flinch. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, but when I spun around, nothing was amiss. Only the ceaseless, hungry hum of the machines now seeming to chant. How long had I been standing here, rooted to the spot, letting its influence seep into me? Days, hours. Time had become a liquid thing, stretching and contracting without logic. I stumbled towards the door, the linoleum floor suddenly feeling spongy under my worn boots. Each step was a battle against an invisible current. The hallway outside was no longer the familiar, albeit dusty, passage I'd navigated countless times. The wallpaper, which had been a faded floral pattern, now depicted a swirling vortex of sepia-toned faces, all of them vaguely familiar, yet none truly identifiable. They were like ghosts of memories, half-recalled ancestors, historians, scholars, the very people whose lives I'd devoted myself to understanding. Their eyes, painted in exquisite, unsettling detail, seemed to follow me. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my exhaustion. This wasn't just the manor twisting. It was my world, my history, my identity being systematically dismantled and reassembled into a grotesque mockery. I pushed onward, driven by a primal need to escape the suffocating presence. I tried the door to the drawing room, but it opened onto what looked like my childhood bedroom, meticulously recreated down to the worn teddy bear on the bed. I slammed the door shut, my breath catching in my throat. My heart hammered, not with the cliché of a drum, but with a frantic, irregular flutter like a trapped bird. My head pounded. Every turn presented a new distortion. A university lecture hall where the professor's face was a shifting collage of forgotten historical figures. A library filled with books whose pages were blank or contained only indecipherable glyphs. A vast, echoing archive where the scent of old paper was replaced by the cloying sweetness of decay. My legs threatened to give out. My mind, once my sanctuary, my tool, was now a battleground. The echo weaver was here, fully manifest, sifting through the layers of my consciousness, plucking out cherished moments, significant facts, the very bedrock of who I was, and twisting them into weapons against me. It wasn't just feeding on memories, it was feeding on the cohesion of my identity. What was the point? How could I fight something that was literally consuming my essence, turning my own history against me? I was a historian, a keeper of facts, a weaver of narratives. But what if the weaver was doing the same, only with malicious intent, creating a new, monstrous narrative from my scattered fragments? Then, amidst the crushing weight of hopelessness, a flicker. A memory oddly pristine cutting through the chaos. It was of a lecture years ago on the destructive power of misinformation in historical records. How a single, well-placed lie, if believed, could unravel entire dynasties, rewrite national identities. A dangerous thought, a desperate one, began to form. The weaver fed on specific memories and identities. It sought to integrate them, to make them part of its own twisted tapestry. But what if it could be poisoned? What if its hunger could be turned against it? If it thrived on order, on coherent narratives, what would happen if it ingested utter chaos? A torrent of conflicting, impossible, utterly fabricated histories. A deliberate, malicious counter-narrative so potent, so disruptive, that it would destabilize its very being. It was a suicidal thought. To construct such a thing, to conjure such a powerful anti-truth, would require diving deeper into my own mind, into the very core of my historical knowledge, and twisting it. I would have to become a purveyor of lies, of anti-facts, and offer them up as bait. It would mean risking my own mental integrity, perhaps even shattering my identity beyond repair, even if I survived. My mind, the very vessel it coveted, would be flooded with chaos. I would be offering it a poisoned chalice, but the poison would have to come from within me. My hands trembled, but a grim resolve began to solidify in my gut. It was a desperate gamble, a last resort. If I was to be a vessel, I would be one filled with fire. I would make myself an indigestible meal. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the humid air. I pressed my palms against my temples, as if I could physically push back against the throbbing in my skull. I was in the laundry room with humming machines, the low, guttural thrum of the ancient industrial washers and dryers a constant, grinding drone beneath my thoughts. It was a strange place to find myself, an anachronism in this crumbling manor, yet here I was, huddled against a stack of mildewed sheets, trying to make sense of the madness. The weaver. It wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It was something far older, far more insidious. A predator of identity, a parasite that fed on the echoes of lives, the specific threads that made a person them. My lineage, my connection to this place, it was a banquet for it. And I, Jasper, was the main course. My hands, still trembling, clutched a heavy, leather-bound journal I'd found tucked away in a forgotten chest in the servants' quarters, a diary belonging to an ancestor, a distant cousin from the late 1800s. Her entries, frantic and despairing, spoke of the shadow thief and its insatiable hunger. She tried to fight it too, failed. But her final entry, scrawled in faint, spider-thin script, offered a glimmer. It seeks not merely to consume, but to become. To truly defeat it, one must offer it that which it cannot stomach, an identity unmade, a memory unwritten. An identity unmade, a memory unwritten. The humming of the machine seemed to intensify, vibrating through the concrete floor, up my legs, into my very bones. It felt like the manor itself was a giant, churning mechanism, grinding down everything within it. My plan, desperate as it was, began to coalesce. The weaver fed on specifics. My name, Jasper, my family, Blackwood, my history, meticulously catalogued. These were its anchors, its sustenance. To sever them, to make myself a blank slate, would be to poison it. A subtle shift, a warning. It knew I was planning something. My destination was clear. The crypt beneath the manor. Not the family crypt, but a smaller, older chamber mentioned in the journal, accessible only through a hidden passage behind the library's fireplace. The ancestor called it the Chamber of Unknowing, a place where the earliest Blackwoods had supposedly practiced rites to forget their pain, to shed their burdens. I suspected it was where the weaver's roots truly lay, a focal point for the manor's accumulated, forgotten memories. The journey was a blur of distorted reality. Corridors stretched and twisted, familiar portraits on the walls shifting their gazes, their smiles turning predatory. My mother's gentle scolding, a colleague's dry wit, the laughter of a friend from childhood. My jaw clenched, refusing to turn. These were phantom lures designed to make me cling to the very memories I needed to sacrifice. With a groan of ancient stone and grinding gears, the fireplace swiveled inward, revealing a dust-choked passage. I descended, the rough-hewn steps slick beneath my boots. The passage opened into a circular chamber, far smaller than I'd anticipated. In the center stood a single waist-high stone pedestal, upon which rested a bowl-like depression filled with a viscous, ink-eye black liquid. It wasn't water. It pulsed with a faint, internal light, like captured starlight in a pool of oil. And from it, a low, constant hum emanated, a sound far more ancient and profound than the laundry machines, a sound that resonated deep in my chest. This was it. The core. Reveal/discovery. As I stepped closer, the ink-eye surface of the liquid rippled and faces began to form within it. Not clear, distinct faces, but blurred, swirling impressions, a parade of Blackwoods. My ancestors. I saw the stern gaze of the first laird, the haunted eyes of the cousin whose journal I carried, and then, impossibly, my own reflection. But it was not my reflection. And then the faces merged, twisted, coalescing into a formless, swirling vortex of pure sensation, a hungry maw of forgotten identity. It was here. This wasn't just a pool of memories. It was the weaver itself, its true form, a living reservoir of stolen identities waiting to absorb mine. It wanted me to offer myself, to willingly surrender my name, my history, my very self. "No," I choked out, my voice raw. I'm not here to be consumed." The ink-eye surface churned violently. "Then what are you here for, Jasper Blackwood? To resist the inevitable. Your lineage is my feast, your identity my sustenance." It knew my plan, or at least it sensed my intent. This was the profound sacrifice, to sever the very connection that defined me, that it craved. I took a deep, shuddering breath. "I am here," I said, my voice gaining a strange strength, "to unmake myself." I looked into the churning depths, into the vortex of my ancestors, into the swirling impression of my own past. I had to let go, not just of the fear, but of everything that made me Jasper. My love for history, my meticulous nature, my connection to this family, even the very sound of my name. Each memory, each defining trait was a thread it could pull. "I am not Jasper," I declared, the words feeling alien on my tongue. "I am no one." The weaver recoiled, the ink-eye pool bubbling violently, spitting droplets that hissed as they hit the stone floor. It was like striking a vampire with sunlight or a demon with holy water. My declaration, the conscious act of dissolving my own identity, was poison. "You cannot." The chorus of voices shrieked, now laced with genuine pain, confusion. "You are Jasper, you are Blackwood, you are mine." I closed my eyes, picturing every photograph, every document, every item I had cataloged in the archives. I saw my mother's face, my father's quiet smile. I felt the comfort of my old armchair, the smell of dust and old paper. And then, with a terrible, wrenching effort, I pushed them away. I willed myself to forget. Memories flashed, too fast to grasp, like individual frames of a film reel burning away. The chamber of unknowing filled with a deafening, guttural scream, a sound of pure agony and unraveling. The ink-eye pool thrashed, sending waves of black liquid crashing against the pedestal, the walls. The faces within writhed, stretching, contorting, then dissolving into featureless smears. The hum intensified to an unbearable pitch, vibrating through the very air, threatening to shatter my eardrums. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The sweet, bruised plum scent was gone, replaced by the damp earth and decay. I opened my eyes. I looked down at my hands, at my clothes. I knew they were mine, but the sense of belonging, of ownership, felt distant. Who was I? The question hung in the air, unanswered, terrifying. I had made the sacrifice. I had unmade myself. But at what cost? And what, if anything, remained? The searing pain behind my eyes didn't just fade, it snapped. One moment, a white-hot agony tearing through the fabric of my mind. The next, a profound, echoing emptiness. It was as if a crucial gear in a complex mechanism had simply vanished, leaving a silent, hollow space where it once churned. My name, Jasper. The sound of it in my head felt like a word learned from a book, not something intrinsically mine. My lineage, the Blackwood history I'd chased with such fervent curiosity, was a series of faded images like old photographs glimpsed through rippling water. The faces, the dates, the connections. They were there but lacked the emotional weight, the personal resonance they once held. They were facts, not memories. I found myself slumped against something cold and damp, the rough stone of a corridor wall, I thought. My body felt heavy, sluggish, as if I'd been submerged in thick treacle. A metallic tang coated my tongue, and my head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that settled deep behind my eyes. The air, usually thick with the scent of dust and ancient parchment, now carried only a faint, almost imperceptible sweetness, like dried lavender or old potpourri, but with an unsettling, metallic undercurrent. My reflection in a nearby tarnished mirror startled me. My face was gaunt, streaked with grime, my eyes wide and bloodshot. But it wasn't just the physical state that unnerved me, it was the expression. It was a mask, I realized, behind which something essential was missing. I tried to focus, to pull at the threads of my recent past. The manor, the archives, the strange carvings. They were all there like items on a checklist, but the why, the feeling behind them, that was gone. The driving compulsion, the historian's hunger for truth, had been replaced by a quiet hum, a subtle vibration within my skull. The grand staircase, the library with its towering shelves, the drawing room where I'd first felt the prickle of unease, they were all just rooms now. The malevolent entity, the echo weaver, it was gone, or so I told myself. But the profound sense of loss, the gaping hole where my own identity should have been, suggested a victory bought at an unimaginable price. My feet carried me, almost instinctively, to the lower levels. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the faint, clean scent of detergent. 2 industrial-sized washing machines and a dryer pulsed with a low, rhythmic thrum, their cycles long since finished, yet still emanating a residual warmth and vibration. The room was spotless, meticulously organized, a stark contrast to the rest of the decaying manor. Clean, folded linens were stacked neatly on a table, smelling faintly of synthetic spring rain. It was a bizarre pocket of domesticity in a house of ghosts, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the mundane drone wash over me. But then I noticed it, not on the machines or the clean clothes, but on the small wooden stool tucked into a corner. A single, intricately carved wooden bird, no bigger than my thumb. It wasn't one of the symbols I'd found in the manor's archives, nor did it resemble any local fauna. It was a stylized, almost abstract form, its wings spread as if in perpetual flight, its tiny head turned back, looking over its shoulder. The hum of the machine suddenly felt less comforting, more like a low, resonant frequency, a vibration that resonated with the one in my own head. I picked up the bird. It was feather-light, cool to the touch. The collection continues. My own memories were still fragmented, blurry around the edges, but suddenly a new clarity emerged. Not my clarity, but a borrowed one. I understood the nature of the echo weaver not as an external threat, but as a process, a cycle. It didn't consume and destroy, it integrated. It didn't just take memories, it absorbed the essence, the identity, leaving behind a husk, a vessel. And then it moved on, or rather, it expanded. Looking at the tiny bird, then around the unnaturally pristine laundry room, I saw it. The meticulous order, the faint, sweet scent. It wasn't just a clean room, it was a new kind of order. An order that reflected a different sensibility, a different purpose. My purpose, perhaps. I walked back up the stairs, the bird clutched in my hand. The horror wasn't gone. It had simply changed shape, found a new host, a new vantage point. I was Jasper, yes, but the name felt like a label on a jar, not the substance within. The hunger that had driven me to unravel the manor's secrets was still there, but it was subtly altered, refined, a hunger for patterns, for echoes. I reached the grand hall. I looked at my reflection again in the tarnished mirror. My eyes were still wide, still bloodshot, but now they held a peculiar glint, a spark of recognition, not of myself, but of something else. Something ancient and profoundly, terribly awake. The Echo Weaver hadn't been defeated. It had simply found a new way to weave. And I, Jasper, was now the loom, and so was I.